You are 11 years old, sitting on the Kowalski family's back porch, watching Mr. Kowalski hand his son a folded $20 bill for mowing a lawn that took 40 minutes. Your father mows the same size lawn for a landscaping company, 8 hours a day, and comes home smelling like gasoline and says nothing at dinner. You don't understand yet why 120 feels different from the other. You just know it does. Mr. Kowalski doesn't hand over the 20 and walk away. He sits down next to his son on the porch steps and says, "Now what are you going to do with it? Not good job, not go buy candy." A question. You've never once been asked that question in your own house. In your house, money that arrives gets absorbed immediately into whatever hole is closest. The electric bill, the church envelope, the hole in your brother's sneaker. Nobody asks a $20 bill what it's for. It already has somewhere to go before it lands in a hand. That porch is the first time you notice there's a version of childhood where money comes with a conversation attached to it, and a version where it doesn't. You don't have language for it at 11. You just carry the porch home with you like a splinter you can't locate. You grow up and the splinter stays. At 24, you're managing a used car lot in Toledo, decent money, benefits, a 401k you contribute to because a coworker named Priya told you to. You marry, you have a son, Owen, and somewhere around Owen's 3rd birthday you catch yourself doing the exact thing your father did. Money arrives, money gets absorbed, no conversation attached. You hand Owen a $5 bill for helping carry groceries and say, "Good job, buddy," and that's it. The transaction closes. You don't even notice you've done it until that night, lying in bed, when the porch comes back to you for the first time in 15 years. You start paying attention differently after that. Not obsessively, you don't have money to obsess over yet, but you start noticing the specific of how wealthier parents talk to their kids about money. At Owen's birthday parties, at the pool, in line at the bank, and you start writing it down. Not because you're building a business yet, because you're trying to figure out what Mr. Kowalski knew that your father didn't, and it isn't a bigger paycheck. Your father made $19 an hour toward the end. Mr. Kowalski's landscaping company grossed maybe $340,000 a year, and he still climbed into a truck most mornings. The gap wasn't income. The gap was 6 specific things, and once you saw them, you couldn't stop seeing them. The first thing. Rich parents let their kids see money fail. When Owen is 7, you buy him a $30 lemonade stand kit, and he loses $12 of it on a Saturday when nobody drives down your street. Your instinct, the instinct you grew up with, is to quietly make up the difference so he doesn't feel it. You don't. You let the $12 stay lost. Wealthier parents don't protect their kids from losing money. They protect them from losing it. Without learning why. Owen sits at the kitchen table and works out, on his own, that Saturdays on a dead-end street don't work, but Saturdays outside the soccer fields might. He's not traumatized by $12. He's calibrated by it. In your house growing up, losses were never discussed, only survived. Silence around a loss teaches a kid to fear money. A conversation around a loss teaches a kid to interrogate it. You start keeping a mental list around this time, not because you plan to do anything with it, but because a list is the only way to hold on to something that keeps almost slipping past you. You notice these things the way you'd notice a language being spoken in another room. Familiar shapes, unfamiliar words. You start listening for it everywhere. At the grocery store, at church, in the school pickup line. Once you know to look for it, you can't stop finding it, and you can't stop noticing its absence in your own house either, retroactively, like a photograph developing years late. The second thing. Rich parents separate the price of something from the value of it, out loud, in front of their kids. You watch this happen at a birthday party when a father named Desmond takes his daughter shopping for a birthday gift with a $60 budget, and refuses to just say yes or no to whatever she points at. Instead, he asks her, every time, "Is that worth more to you than the other things we could get for $60? It's a small sentence, but you clock what it's actually doing, training a 9-year-old to think in trade-offs instead of impulses. In your childhood, the only question that ever got asked about anything was, "Can we afford it?" A yes or no gate. Desmond's daughter is being asked a completely different question, not "Can we?" but "Is this the best use of it?" That's the difference between a kid who grows up checking their bank balance their whole life and a kid who grows up allocating capital. The third thing. Rich parents give their kids exposure to ownership before they give them exposure to income. Around this time, you start doing books for a few small businesses on the side, extra cash, nothing dramatic, and one of your clients, a dentist named Marcus, mentions offhand that his 14-year-old owns 4 shares of an index fund he opens the statement for together every quarter. 4 shares, maybe $380 total. It's not about the money. It's that Marcus's kid has, by 14, already sat through a dozen conversations about what owning a piece of a company means, what a dividend is, why the number goes down sometimes, and that's not a catastrophe. You didn't know what a share of stock was until you were 26, and Priya explained it to you at the car lot, slowly, like she was talking to someone recovering from something. Because you were. The fourth thing. Rich parents let debt be a tool in conversation instead of a shame in silence. Your father took out one loan in his life, for the truck, and it hung over every dinner like weather nobody would name directly. Marcus, the dentist, has a mortgage, a business line of credit, and he talks about both openly at his own kitchen table. Which debt is good, which purchase is appreciating, why he'd never finance a jet ski but would happily finance equipment that pays for itself in 14 months. His kids grow up understanding debt has a function. Not just a weight. You grew up understanding debt only as a wound that had already happened to someone. The fifth thing, and this is the one that changes you most. Rich parents let their kids negotiate, and they let them lose the negotiation sometimes too. You watch this most clearly with a family at Owen's school, the Ferraros. Their son Nico wants a later curfew, and instead of a flat no, his mother makes him build a case. What he'll trade for it. What changes if he breaks the new curfew once. What the actual ask even is versus what he initially blurted. Half the time Nico doesn't get the deal he wanted. But he leaves every single one of those conversations having practiced the exact muscle that, 20 years later, will decide whether he asks for a $40,000 raise or accepts whatever's offered, whether he negotiates his first business contract or signs the first draft out of relief that someone wants to work with him at all. Nobody in your childhood ever asked you to make a case for anything. Rules simply arrived, finished, non-negotiable, the way the electric bill arrived. You realize, years later, that this is why you didn't ask for a raise until you were 29, and even then you didn't ask. You hinted, sideways, and waited for someone else to notice, the way you used to wait for your father to notice the hole in your shoe, instead of asking him to look at it directly. Nico Ferraro, by contrast, negotiates his first job offer at 19 and gets an extra $2 an hour because his mother spent a decade teaching him that a closed door is just the start of a conversation, not the end of one. The sixth thing takes you the longest to name because it isn't a lesson so much as an atmosphere. Rich parents talk about money in front of their kids as an ongoing, unemotional, recurring subject, not a crisis that gets whispered about behind a closed bedroom door and then never mentioned again once it passes. In your house, money only ever surfaced as an emergency, discussed in tight voices after you were supposed to be asleep, then vanishing back into silence until the next emergency. You grew up believing money was something you weren't allowed to see, like it was dangerous to look at directly. Owen, now 9, sees you and your wife go over the budget on the 15th of every month at the kitchen table. No crisis attached, no lowered voices, just a recurring, boring 30-minute Tuesday night habit, the same as folding laundry. He doesn't know yet how rare that boredom is. That's the whole point. Boredom around money is a privilege you're building for him on purpose. By the time you're 34, the side bookkeeping work has become an actual firm. 11 small business clients, $310,000 a year, nothing spectacular, but stable enough that the specific fear from your childhood, the mail slot fear, doesn't live in your house anymore. You could stop there. Instead, you start doing something almost nobody in your family has ever done. You start narrating your own decisions out loud to Owen, on purpose, the way Mr. Kowalski once narrated a $20 bill to his son on a porch you never forgot. When Owen is 11, the exact age you were on that porch, you sit him down with $200 of his own saved birthday money, and instead of telling him what to do with it, you ask him the question that took you 20 years to hear asked out loud. What do you want this money to do for you? He says he wants a new bike. You don't say yes or no. You ask him to price out 3 bikes, figure out what he'd have left over, and decide whether he'd rather have the bike now or let the $200 sit for 4 months and see what it could become instead. He picks the bike. That's fine. The bike was never the point. The question was. At 41, you buy out your largest competitor for $1.2 million, financed partly through the exact kind of good debt conversation Marcus used to have at his kitchen table, and the firm crosses $2.6 million in annual revenue the following year. None of it erases the porch, or the mail slot, or the silence at your childhood dinner table. It just sits on top of it now, the way everything eventually does. Owen is 15 the year you make your first angel investment, $25,000 into a friend's logistics software, the kind of check Marcus used to write when Owen was still in diapers. You don't hide the paperwork in a drawer the way your father hid the truck loan. You spread it across the kitchen table and walk Owen through it. What equity means, what happens if the company fails completely, what happens if it doesn't. He asks better questions than you did at 26, explaining stock to yourself for the first time. That's not because Owen is smarter than you were. It's because he's had 9 years of Tuesday night budget meetings and a $200 bike question and a lost $12 lemonade stand behind him already. You didn't get lucky raising a kid who understands money. You built the porch on purpose, plank by plank, the one Mr. Kowalski built for his son, without you ever getting invited to sit on it. The investment goes nowhere for 3 years, then triples. Owen watches all 3 years of nothing happen before he watches it triple, because you never once shielded him from the boring middle part, the part with no lesson in it yet, just waiting. That's maybe the 7th thing, the one underneath all the others. Rich parents let their kids be bored by money long enough to stop being afraid of it. You still think about your father sometimes, mowing lawns 8 hours a day for a company that made in 1 week what he made in a month, never once sitting down with you to ask what you wanted a dollar to do. He wasn't a bad father. He never had a porch of his own to learn it on. Nobody handed him the 6 things, or the 7th. He was inheriting silence the same way you almost did, and the only real difference between his house and yours now isn't the number in the bank account, it's that money finally gets to talk in this one. Owen doesn't know what a coffee tin is, or a mail slot that changes the temperature of a room. He just knows that on the 15th of every month his parents sit at the table for half an hour, and money is boring, ordinary, discussed out loud like weather. He has no idea how extraordinary that boredom is. He doesn't need to. That was the whole plan. You still catch yourself sometimes, reaching for the old instinct. The one that says, close the conversation quickly, hand over the money, don't let the number sit in the open air too long. It's not gone. It probably never fully goes. But you catch it now, most of the time, before it becomes the only thing Owen learns from you about money. That's not nothing. That might be the whole inheritance, actually. Not the $2.6 million, not the buyout, not the angel check that tripled, just the catching. Tell me in the comments, what's the one money lesson you had to teach yourself that you wish someone had just told you?